Hello there guys, Daniel Childs back here again. Hope you're doing really well on this Wednesday. In today's show, we're going to be talking about the striker search, a link to Isak from Newcastle. Is that at all realistic? And also just kind of the broader striker search, which is confusing me. I think is confusing some other people. So we'll get into that. And then also this wage structure problem that Simon Johnson has really delved into for The Athletic. We're going to go through some of the detail within that of maybe Chelsea's stance changing, but how consistent is that? Why do we keep on hearing very different things about what Chelsea's stance are in terms of some transfers compared to others? We'll get into that too. Please hit that like button if you're enjoying the content, share around with friends, but let's jump into it firstly with Alexander Isak. So Daily Mail reporting that Chelsea have made an inquiry for Isak, but would have to basically break their club record fee that, of course, we paid for Caicedo last year. And before that, obviously, it was Enzo Fernandez. But apparently, Mailsport understands conversations have taken place between the clubs and the Blues have indicated they want to sign the Swedish international. Now, I don't usually take transfer stories from the Daily Mail, but the reason I have on this case is Craig Hope, one of the journalists reporting this, is a local-based reporter. I think a respected local-based reporter for Newcastle, covers the club very extensively. I think has a following as well, and I believe even posts match reviews to YouTube. So, you know, someone who clearly is well linked and knows the club very well. That doesn't always mean, you know, just because you know one side doesn't mean you know the other. Like, you'll know what's going on at Newcastle. You may not know that well what's going on at Chelsea, but still, I think there is some weight to this. But I just think in terms of a broader conversation, it, you know, ties into what Chelsea are trying to look for in a striker this summer. Now, my very cynical, which, you know, I am guilty of doing quite recently, my cynical way of looking at this is we've inquired for Isak. He's too expensive. What were we supposed to do? And we'll just get back to doing what we like doing, which is signing Barcelona youngsters like Marc Guiu, who, of course, has been brought in for around 6 million, really young striker. Barely any football in the first team for Barcelona. I think he had 73 minutes in the Liga last year, scored a goal and has done well at Spanish Youth ranks. But in terms of gauging a true quality of this player, it's very difficult. It does give me a little bit David Washington vibes, and that's not talking about the player being rubbish, or it's just I don't know if this player is going to actually get extensive minutes. I mean, the way it's being briefed is he wants to compete in the first team, and that's why he's left Barcelona. That is one of the reasons he's left, is because he believes there's a chance for him. We'll see how that goes in pre-season. I think, you know, it's a very nice thing to say right now, but because of the competition, it's going to be there for him. It's going to be, you know, high for him. And even if, you know, it gets into, if Chelsea sign another striker on top of him, then I think it becomes more challenging. So we'll see how that goes. But it's not that much of a surprise for Chelsea to be signing a player of his ilk and experience. It's what they've been doing over the past year. And it's not the most ridiculous fee. I just wonder if he'll actually ever play seriously for Chelsea. Yeah, that's a broader question. But in terms of Isak, you know, it goes into this broader point that a couple of weeks ago when we were being linked heavily with Duran from Aston Villa, and I think it made a lot more sense because, you know, clearly they were looking at a more physical presence. They were looking at someone who wasn't going to cost the world, who wasn't going to come in and probably instantly take over from Jackson, who'd obviously had a really good season. And you want to keep that development going. You've obviously got Nkunku, who can play as a centre forward as well. And maybe as well, Maresca wants to look at even, say, David Datcher Fofana over pre-season, even though there's been reports of Chelsea looking to move him on. We'll see how that goes. But the way it's gone from him to Jonathan David, to other names too, I think Jonathan David and now Isak, it is really confused. And even now hearing reports that Chelsea don't even necessarily are looking now for a centre forward. They're looking for kind of a variety of attackers. And I've questioned this, and some people have kind of fired back and been like, well, they're casting the net very wide. And I don't think that casting the net very wide is always a great thing, because we're talking about players who are not only different in terms of experience level on the pitch, we're also talking about what profile forward they are, what do they offer compared to what they don't. And in terms of Isak, this is a first choice player. This is someone who be coming in as a major upgrade. If Chelsea sign him this summer, I think would be a good signing. I think Isak is a very, very good Premier League forward, but it would cost a lot, and you're kind of changing them what your kind of frame is for the season. And I guess more broadly, this links into the wage structure, which is what I want to talk about, because Simon Johnson wrote this extensive piece in terms of Michael Olise stepping away, and is their wage structure a problem? So we'll go through some of the things he said, because he gives a lot of detail over the background, over what Chelsea have been doing, but then also kind of questioning it for the long term, which is what I've done as well. He speaks about how when the Todd Bowley Clearlake Consortium bought the club 2 years ago, part of their plan was to dramatically reduce the wage bill. The theory is that recruiting up-and-coming players on lower salaries and long contracts means big savings overall because you avoid having to discuss extensions and pay rises with every individual and the subsequent agent's commission every 2 to 3 years. Plus, if the day comes where a player asks to leave the club or decides to sell, it should be easier to do so because their wages do not price them out of a move. Apparently, another aspect to this is assisting with this introducing incentivized contracts. We've spoken a lot about this, where kind of a justification for Chelsea's transfer model is that, well, we have them on low wages, but if the club does well, these players are going to be eventually offered competitive wage packets because they will be doing well if the club does well. So the ability is to reward or effectively punish what the team does in a season. For example, most acquisitions made after 2022 suffered a pay cut in the 23-24 campaign because the club obviously did not qualify for Europe. And even players who renegotiated deals he mentions here, like Reece James, had a percentage taken away. And new arrivals have a pay that reflects whether they are regular starters or not. And of course, Raheem Sterling is the exception. And he does bring up sort of the older flops, I guess you'd call them, a little bit crudely. The ones that were bought in that very first summer, which is very different to the model Chelsea are operating under now with the sporting directors, where we bought, of course, Kalidou Koulibaly, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang. We bought Raheem Sterling on a 300k a week contract. Lukaku is obviously brought into this, obviously not a Clearlake signing pre-dem, but it's still someone on Chelsea's books that still hasn't been permanently sold. And the issues, of course, if you sign for massive wages and a decent fee an older player that doesn't work out, the sell-on value, that those players take up a lot of funds very quickly. So it's not kind of dismissing that you just instantly go for all 30-year-olds and that's a great strategy. We've seen overall at Chelsea, you know, it's one extreme to the next. It's either signing maybe too inexperienced players or signing players too old that then don't give you a sell-on value. So maybe there's a bit of nuance within that, absolutely. But I think the thing that has really caught fire, or at least I've seen reacted to a lot, is this bit of his piece. And it says, there is no strict wage policy in place. Cases will be judged on an individual basis. It is not as if Chelsea have ruled out the possibility of ever offering a player the kind of salary Bayern did to Elise ever again. But the numbers achieved would have to justify it more than what Elise or Nico Williams, who's also mentioned in this piece, have managed in their careers. Having this strict criteria in place means they will inevitably lose or pull out of more signings in the future for the same reason. And then he does bring up the argument I have before, which is that it's all right and nice having this theory, but if the club doesn't start winning soon, those incentivized contracts don't look as good. And even if players are being punished for that failure, it doesn't mean that other clubs can't come in and try and capitalize on that and trying to sign those players. And I said this the other day, I'll keep saying it because I just think it's a reality that it's banking on Chelsea being successful very quickly, which is obviously what we all hope. But it also banks on maybe the wages coming down more generally. I saw some of you comment on my last show where we talked about PSR, and maybe the hope is that, you know, if PSR is rolled back or PSR remains and it kind of forces more generally in the Premier League wages to come down, that obviously would help Chelsea in this strategy a lot. But I think firstly, it's a little bit confusing because the briefing around Elise is finances, and we strictly don't want to break this wage structure. It's the same with Nico Williams, and we're only going to do it on players who truly justify it, which for me is a little bit confusing because, you know, who would justify it? And, you know, a lot of those players that would justify it are going to cost a hell of a lot more and also are going to be older, which is not preferable to their current model. So, you know, Tosin was brought in at 26, but he was a free agent. You know, they didn't have to pay a transfer fee for him. And a lot of the names that have been brought up, like Isak, for instance, you know, I think surely he would count as someone who'd be worth it. So we'll see how that situation develops. But again, that would be rolling back what they do. And, you know, I do ponder if it's just like they sometimes see the reaction online, which again, maybe you think it sounds inconsistent from me, but, you know, it sounds like at times flip-flopping. Are they just putting stuff out there because they see a negative reaction and they want to kind of assure people? But again, I think actions are more kind of concrete and more, you know, informative of Chelsea's strategy rather than just nice briefings. You know, I will see if their wage structure is going to stay the way it is or whether they're going to be forced to eventually sort of be adaptive or flexible over this, because eventually I think they're going to have to be. And if you want to buy the top players, there is just a harsh reality. If you develop a lot of those big players internally, yeah, sure. But if you're not being competitive, if you're not winning trophies, then those incentives aren't going to really come to the fore, as I think a lot of them, they're kind of hopeful will. Because, you know, if you're not winning the Champions League, if you're not winning the Premier League, if you're not getting Champions League football, the revenue obviously isn't coming in a big way for a club like Chelsea, who have spent a lot. So I still find the wage thing just an interesting kind of theory exercise by the club that I think so far isn't really helping them out, because, you know, you've stepped away from Michael Elise to actually upgrade the current first team squad in a significant way, unless you are uncovering Cole Palmer, which I think is very difficult to do on a regular basis. I'm not having a go at the club for not uncovering Cole Palmer every summer, because Cole Palmer, as we saw again for England last night, is one of a kind. He's a genius transfer for a low fee. But those things happen very few and far between. I think actually finding players like that who are going to cost sufficient money, you know, you are going to have to sort of be flexible. And I just wonder whether Chelsea will. And I think that's the big question. And if football doesn't come along with Chelsea, if football doesn't really adapt and it's still about giving players high wages at the top level, and if you want to buy those players, you're going to have to compete, then Chelsea have got a real problem. So I think on two fronts here, I want to ask you guys in the comments in terms of the striker situation, because I'm a little bit confused over targets at the moment. I really am, in terms of what are actually Chelsea looking for. Is it just, you know, putting feelers out there a lot of the time, but actually nothing serious is going to happen this summer, and really it's only going to be those kind of under 20 or under 23 players that are going to be bought once again, and we'll stick with what we have, which I said at the start of the summer, I'm not fully against. I'm very interested to see Nicholas Jackson develop a further season. I'd like to see David Datro given a bit of a chance in the Chelsea first team, at least over pre-season. Of course, we know Nkunku could even play as centre forward. So I'm not sitting here and going, if we don't sign a centre forward at all, it's a disaster. Absolutely not. But I just, you know, if you're going to be serious, be serious. If you're not going to be serious, you know, don't pretend. You know, are we actually willing to get serious in the market and buy significant players that are going to make the team radically better, or are we not? Because it just looks a little bit confusing. And, you know, if they are targeting a centre forward, I'd be more curious to see what is the profile, because going from Duran to Jonathan David to Isak to younger centre forwards, I mean, to me it looks a little bit confused. And if we're talking about players actually for the first team, which in the majority of cases we're not talking about players for Strasbourg, we're not talking about players for the academy, we're talking about players who are going to come into the first team and help Enzo Maresca. I don't think it's unreasonable to kind of ask, why does this look so muddled? So those are my thoughts today. Please let me know yours in the comments below about everything I spoke about. And yeah, we'll be back again soon. We'll obviously be getting closer now to Cobham being filled up with Chelsea players again. I'm sure we're going to see some Chelsea players next week, and that'll be quite exciting. And also that Enzo Maresca first Chelsea media interview press conference, I'm sure it will be happening next week. So we'll be covering on the show. I'll see you again very soon. All the best.